packet from Rawlins. Thought you'd...
I've seen it.
Men out west don't deserve you, Emma.
You're drunk, Mr. Tilman. Go home.
Not drunk enough to stop offering you a decent future.
The Hollow Land. The first gunshot cracked through the pines the same morning her letter came back unopened. It was April of 1875, and the wind out of the San Juan Mountains carried the smell of thawing snow-sharp, metallic restless. Dust rolled down the single street of Whispering Pines, a frontier town too small to forget its own gossip. Emma Whitaker stood by the schoolhouse window, with the envelope in her hand, the red ink on its front, already bleeding from her grip. Unclaimed return to sender. That was all it said, and it was enough. The man in Wyoming, J.M. Carter, the one who had written 8 polite, hopeful letters, and promised to come by the spring stage, was never coming at all. Outside the shot belonged to some drunk celebrating the new whiskey shipment at the saloon, but the sound still made the children flinch. "Keep reading," Emma told them gently. Her voice, though soft, steadied the room. The wind ran wild across the plain. Inside her, the wind was running wild too. When the lesson ended, she packed her books and walked home through the rutted street. The air tasted of iron and sage. Holcomb's General Store sat in its usual sun-faded quiet. The bell above the door chimed as she entered. "Afternoon," Miss Whitaker said, old Holcomb from behind the counter. "Got a packet from Rawlins. Thought you'd—" "I've seen it," she said quickly, showing him the envelope. He nodded, eyes soft with pity. "Men out west don't deserve you, Emma." She smiled without mirth. "I'm not looking for a man, Mr. Holcomb. I was looking for a roof that doesn't leak." He sighed and began weighing flour. Outside sunlight shifted. The wind brought the sound of hooves. A tall rider was coming in from the north-gray horse dust, to his knees eyes hidden beneath the brim of a weather-worn hat. When he dismounted, his shadow stretched half across the street. Samuel Reed Holcomb murmured half to himself. "Lives up in the foothills, 6 months at a time without a soul to talk to." Emma didn't look up, but she felt the air in the room change when the door opened again. Boots on pine boards, the smell of leather and trail dust, the presence of someone used to silence. Out in the street, Frank Tilman staggered from the saloon, whiskey glinting in his grin. "Schoolmarm," he called. "Heard your fancy feller from Wyoming ain't comin'. Guess the letter took longer than the man's nerve." Emma froze the paper bag in her hands, crinkling. "You're drunk, Mr. Tilman. Go home. Not drunk enough to stop offering you a decent future." He lurched closer, hand outstretched. Across the street, Samuel Reed turned from tying his mare. His movement was slow, deliberate, a man measuring distance the way soldiers measure danger. "The lady said no," he said, voice low as thunder before it breaks. Tilman sneered. "Ain't your business, stranger." "It is now." For a long heartbeat, no one breathed. The wind hissed against the shutters. Then Tilman spat in the dust and backed off, muttering, "You'll regret crossin' me." When he was gone, Emma found her breath again. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't need rescuing, but—" "Thank you." "Wasn't rescuin'," Samuel replied. "Just hate drunks wastin' a quiet afternoon." That evening, as she walked the narrow lane toward her cottage, the envelope still in her pocket, Emma thought of the man who had written her name 8 times and the stranger who had spoken it once. One had promised a future and vanished. The other hadn't promised a thing, yet stood his ground when no one else would. She didn't believe in fate, only in choices people made and paid for. But that night, when the wind howled around her chimney, she fed the letter to the fire. The flame licked the words J.M. Carter, Rawlins, Wyoming, until they turned to ash. Across town, in a rented room above Widow Perkins's boarding house, Samuel Reed watched his own fire burn low and wondered, for reasons he couldn't name, why he hadn't already left Whispering Pines behind. The rain and the letterbox. Rain came at dusk, the way it always did in the foothills, sudden, hard, uninvited. By the time Emma left the schoolhouse, the street of Whispering Pines had turned to a river of mud. Her shawl clung to her shoulders, soaked through, and the small stack of student papers she'd tried to shield beneath it had dissolved into a gray pulp. The wind shoved against her bonnet like a hand that meant to turn her back, but she kept walking. She was used to weather that argued. The lanterns in town had begun to blur into trembling halos. Down at the far end of Main Street, the saloon doors banged open, laughter spilling out and vanishing in the rain's steady roar. She cut through the alley behind the general store, boots squelching, and nearly collided with Samuel Reed leading his horse toward Widow Perkins's stables. He'd stripped off his coat to keep the mare dry. Water ran from the brim of his hat in a steady trickle. "Miss Whitaker," he said, tipping the hat slightly, though it served no purpose now. "Mr. Reed," she answered, breathless hair plastered to her face. "You'll catch your death out here." "Already caught it a few winters back," he replied, voice even. "I'm too stubborn to die twice." She almost smiled, and that was dangerous. Men like him had a way of making a woman forget the rules she'd built around herself. Inside the boarding house, the smell of stew and soap greeted them both. Widow Perkins clucked her tongue as Emma entered, dripping onto the braided rug. "You'll ruin my floorboards, girl. Come by the fire before you freeze." Emma obeyed, too weary to protest. Samuel followed, nodding politely to the widow before leading his mare through the back to the stable. The parlor was dim and warm lamplight pooling in the corners. A single clock ticked. Outside, the rain turned from curtain to roar. Emma pulled the pins from her hair, spreading it before the fire. She looked half wild, like some spirit washed ashore by the storm. Samuel came back inside a few minutes later, his shirt damp at the shoulders, hat hung on the rack. He sat across from her, silent. His eyes, pale and watchful, reflected the flames. After a while, he said quietly, "Tilman, still trouble you? Not today. He will again. I've lived with worse. Not on my watch." The words slipped out before he could stop them. Emma looked up, startled. "You plan to keep watch, Mr. Reed?" He met her gaze. "Long as I'm in town. And how long is that? Until I stop hearing thunder in the distance." Widow Perkins returned with 2 bowls of stew, muttering about men who carried guns instead of umbrellas. When she left them alone again, the room fell into a hush that felt like held breath. Emma cleared her throat. "Mr. Holcomb said you live alone up near the ridge. Easier that way. Easier isn't always better." He gave her a look that might have been amusement, might have been warning. "You sound like someone who's tried both. I wrote to Wyoming once," she admitted. The fire cracked as if punctuating her words. "A man answered. Said he needed a wife for his homestead. I thought, perhaps that was how one survives out here, by arrangement, not affection." Samuel studied her face. And he never came." She tried to say it lightly, but her voice trembled just enough for him to notice. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't be. Perhaps he changed his mind. Perhaps he died. Or perhaps he was a coward." She looked at him sharply. "You don't mince words, do you?" "No point," Samuel said. "Out here, truth's cheaper than whiskey, and hurts about the same." The clock struck 8. Rain still drummed on the roof. Widow Perkins poked her head in. "If you're staying, Mr. Reed, there's a room upstairs. Miss Whitaker, you take the front guest room. You can settle the bill when the storm quits." Emma began to protest, but a flash of lightning drowned her out, followed by thunder that rattled the windows. Widow Perkins nodded firmly. "No one's riding tonight." When the widow was gone, silence returned. Emma rose, meaning to fetch her things, but the movement dislodged a small bundle from her bag, a stack of letters, tied with fading blue ribbon. They spilled across the carpet like a secret finally loosed. Samuel bent to pick one up, then hesitated when he saw the name on the envelope. "Mr. Jameson Carter, Rawlins, Wyoming." His jaw tightened. That the man, Emma flushed, kneeling to gather them. "They're nothing now. Just paper. Mind if I ask why you kept them? I suppose I wanted proof," she said softly, "that someone once thought I was worth writing to." She gathered the letters and placed them on the mantel. The firelight caught the damp ink, glinting like old blood. For a while neither spoke. The storm outside rose and fell, and between its pulses she could hear the slow rhythm of Samuel's breathing. There was comfort in that something steady against the world's noise. Later, when she stepped into the hall to say goodnight, she found Samuel standing by the letterbox near the front door, staring at the rain beyond the glass. He didn't turn when she approached. "I used to get letters too," he said. His voice was low, shaped by something older than grief. "From my wife." Emma froze. "Used to. She died during the war. Fever took her before I got home. "I'm sorry." "So was I," he said simply, "but the world doesn't care much for sorrow." Lightning flickered again, painting his face in brief relief, a man carved from loss and duty. Emma hesitated, then said, "Maybe it's not the world's job to care. Maybe it's ours for each other." He looked at her, then properly looked, and for the first time she saw the man beneath the silence. Weariness, yes, but also a kind of gentleness that felt almost dangerous. "Good night, Miss Whitaker," he said. "Good night, Mr. Reed." When she reached her room, the wind had blown one of the old letters open on the mantel. She picked it up absently, meaning to retie the ribbon, but her eyes caught the postmark, smudged but legible: Rawlins, December 1874. The handwriting inside was careful, unfamiliar. Not Carter's. Different. Her pulse quickened as she read. "If you still seek a home, Miss Whitaker, there's one in the foothills northwest of Whispering Pine. I'm not a rich man nor a charming one, but I keep my word. S.R." She stared at the initials. The paper shook in her hand. Outside, thunder rolled like distant hooves. Downstairs, Samuel Reed still stood by the window, unaware that the storm had just delivered back the letter he'd written, and that the woman who'd burned her past now held the proof of his own forgotten hope. But the night didn't end there. Sleep eluded Emma. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those initials burned against the dark. S.R. Samuel Reed. It couldn't be. The letter had traveled 200 miles in 2 years, only to find its way back to her hands. Fate didn't work like that. Or maybe it did when the land was vast enough to lose things in. She rose, wrapped her shawl tight, and crossed to the window. The rain had softened into mist. Down below, the lantern in the front room still glowed faintly. He hadn't gone to bed. Something in her refused to wait till morning. Barefoot, she crept down the stairs. The floorboards whispered beneath her weight. Samuel was at the table now, oil lamp casting gold across his rough hands. He was cleaning his revolver habit more than intent, the kind of motion a man used when his mind couldn't rest. He didn't look up when she spoke. "Couldn't sleep. I'm used to the sound of rain on tin roofs," she said, holding the letter at her side. "This one feels different, like it's trying to speak." He set the gun aside, giving her a curious glance. "Storms don't talk, Miss Whitaker. Maybe not to you." She took a step closer, the firelight catching the ribbon in her hand. "I found something downstairs." One of the letters wasn't from Mr. Carter. His expression stilled. "No, no." She laid the paper before him.
Packet from Rawlins.
"It was from you."
Thought you'd
He didn't touch it. His eyes flicked over the words he already knew by heart. A muscle worked in his jaw. That letter never found its mark. It has now. For a long time neither spoke, only the rain tapping the window and the slow creak of the house around them. Finally he said, "I'd written it for a woman I never met. The schoolteacher from back east, they said, was coming. Your predecessor fell ill before she ever made the journey, and the letter must have wandered off to me," Emma finished quietly. "And I took it for a stranger's proposal." His gaze lifted to hers. Seems the stranger wasn't so strange after all. She sat opposite him, the warmth of the lamp between them. "You wrote you weren't rich or charming," she said softly. "You were right about one, not the other." That drew the faintest smile from him, weary but real. "Which way you mean that maybe both?" Outside, the rain eased to a whisper, and the scent of wet pine drifted through the cracked window. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote called long and lonesome. Samuel's eyes followed the sound. "When my wife died, he said, I thought the part of me that believed in letters or God or second chances died with her. I rode till I couldn't tell one horizon from another. Then last winter, I heard they needed a man with a steady hand in Whispering Pines. Figured a quiet town might let the ghosts rest." "Did they?" she asked. He shook his head slowly. "Not yet." Emma folded her hands in her lap, feeling the heat from the stove soak into her skin. "Maybe ghosts don't rest until someone else remembers them kindly." He studied her face, the curve of light on her cheek, the defiance still there under gentleness. "And would you remember mine kindly, Miss Whitaker? I'd try," she said, "if you do the same." They sat until the fire burned low, two exiles in the same small harbor of light. When she finally rose, the clock was striking midnight. She left the letter on the table between them, no longer a relic, but a promise revived. In the morning, whispering pines woke to clear skies. The rain had scrubbed the dust from the mountains, leaving everything sharp and new. Children's laughter echoed from the schoolyard. The world had the clean smell of beginnings. Emma stood on the porch, the letter tucked in her pocket. Samuel was tightening the cinch on his mare, preparing to ride up to the ridge. "You headed out early," she said. "Fence near the creek washed loose. Needs fixing." He paused, looking at her over his shoulder. "You sleep any, a little, enough to decide something." He waited. "I'll stay through the term," she said. "Maybe longer if the town still needs a teacher." His mouth curved, slow and genuine. "They will." As he mounted, she added quietly, "And if the man on the ridge ever needs company on a rainy evening, he knows where to find it." Samuel touched the brim of his hat. "That's so. That's so." He rode out toward the bright horizon, the sound of hoofbeats steady against the morning hush. Emma watched until he vanished beyond the bend, then turned back to the porch. Beside the door sat the old letterbox, rain-spotted but sturdy. She opened it and slid the letter inside, addressed simply to S.R. When the wind came up, it rattled the tin lid like a whisper of laughter. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled again, not as warning, but as remembrance. Shelter morning came thin and gray. The storm had spent itself, leaving the air washed clean and brittle as glass. The world outside the boarding house gleamed like it had been newly minted puddles shining on the hard-packed road, the sky colorless and enormous. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried, once sharp, defiant, and the sound carried over the hills like a thread stitching the land back together. Emma woke to the smell of coffee and the faint sound of Widow Perkins humming somewhere downstairs. For a moment she lay still, staring at the ceiling, replaying the words from the letter she'd read the night before. "If you still seek a home, Miss Whitaker." She had memorized them in a single reading, every curve of the ink etched behind her eyes. The paper now sat folded beneath her pillow, as if proximity might turn mystery into understanding. S.R. 2 letters that refused to rest. Samuel Reed. The initials might have been coincidence, but coincidence rarely rode this far west. When she came down, he was already at the kitchen table, his hair still damp from the morning wash, sleeves rolled up, hands wrapped around a tin cup. The lamplight had burned low, leaving his face caught between gold and shadow. "Morning," he said, and the single word held a rough kindness. "Morning," she replied, pouring herself coffee. The widow clattered plates onto the table and announced that she was off to church early to mend a pew bench. "You two can finish the bread," she said briskly, tying on her shawl. "Try not to burn down my house while I'm gone. I've had my fill of excitement this week." When the door shut behind her, silence returned, the kind that listens. Emma sat opposite him, her hands wrapped around her cup. The steam fogged the glass between them. She wasn't sure whether the tremor in her chest came from nerves or from what she now knew. "Mr. Reed," she began carefully, "did you ever write to someone in Rawlins?" He looked up wary. "Once. A woman." "Yes." Why, he considered his answer for a long time. Because winter was long. Because the house was too quiet. Because a man gets tired of hearing only his own voice. Emma reached into her pocket, drew out the letter she had carried since dawn, and laid it between them like an accusation, or perhaps like an offering. "You wrote this." He stared at the page, recognizing his own hand, square, deliberate, clumsy, the handwriting of a man more used to shaping fences than sentences. "I did." "You sent it to me." His brow furrowed. "I sent it to a Miss Whitaker advertised in a Boston paper. Said she was seeking a husband out west. I never got a reply." Emma's pulse stumbled. "Then the postman must have sent your letter to me by mistake. The ad was from my cousin, her idea, not mine. She used my name because she thought it sounded more respectable." A small, incredulous laugh escaped her. "All this time I thought I'd been writing to a man who never existed, and you thought I'd written to a woman who didn't want me," he finished. They sat there, stunned, the rainwater dripping from the eaves outside, like seconds ticking past. Finally, Samuel spoke. "Seems the storm wanted us to know." "Know what?" "That sometimes the post finds its mark, even when it takes the long way." Emma looked at him, then really looked, the lines around his eyes, the scar at his temple, the steadiness that felt like safety. "I burned my letters," she said quietly. "All but yours." Something flickered in his gaze, a warmth neither of them named. "You didn't burn it," he said. "You just hadn't read it yet." The morning stretched on slow and unhurried. They ate what Widow Perkins had left behind, bread jam, the last of the coffee, and afterward went outside to mend what the storm had broken. The yard still smelled of rain and iron. The fence along the side pasture leaned like an old drunk, its posts sunk deep in mud. Samuel fetched tools from the shed, and Emma followed, lifting her skirts clear of the puddles. "You don't have to help," he said. "I know," she answered, "but I will." Her hair was pinned high, a few loose strands catching the light. She rolled up her sleeves without ceremony and took a hammer from his hand. "You're not afraid of hard work," he said after a while. "School teachers rarely get to be. You could have left this town after the storm. So could you." That earned her a brief smile, the kind that looked unused from disrepair. By noon, the sun had burned through the last of the clouds, and the boards were steady again beneath their nails. They worked in companionable quiet, the rhythm of hammer and breath filling the space where words might have gone. The peace didn't last. A rider appeared at the edge of the road, mud splattering up to his stirrups. Even from a distance, Emma recognized the slump of his shoulders, the defiant set of his jaw. Frank Tilman. He reined in by the hitching post, his horse snorting steam. The bruise on his jaw from their last encounter had yellowed to the color of old parchment. Samuel's body shifted, barely perceptible, but his weight came forward, a man measuring distance to a target. Emma felt her throat tighten. Not again. Tilman swung down, dusting rain from his coat with exaggerated calm. "Came to make peace," he said, hands open. "Marshall gave me a warning, so I'm offering an apology. Proper-like." But the way he looked at Emma betrayed the lie. There was no remorse there, only possession denied. Samuel stepped forward. "Say your piece, and go." Tilman's grin returned, crooked as a bad fence. "You think I came for you, rancher, I came for her." Emma lifted her chin. "You've said enough, Frank." He took a step closer, mud sucking at his boots. "You don't get to tell me what's enough. You turned me down for a stranger. But folks forget things quick out here. A wedding ring changes minds." Samuel's hand hovered near his revolver. "That's close enough." For a moment, Tilman froze. The silence between thunder and strike. Then he laughed, a sound that never reached his eyes. "You can't guard her forever." He turned, spat in the dirt, and rode off his horse, throwing mud like spite. When the echo of hoofbeats faded, Emma sagged against the porch post. "He won't stop. I know." Samuel holstered his gun slowly, his movements deliberate, steady. "That's why you shouldn't be alone. I can take care of myself. I don't doubt that." "Then why do you look at me like I'm about to break?" He hesitated. "Because I know the look of someone who's already had to." The words hit her harder than she expected. She turned away, blinking back something that wasn't quite tears. "You think shelter's something a man gives a woman," she said after a moment. "It's not. It's something two people build between them, or not at all." Samuel nodded once. "Then let's build it." They worked until the light turned amber and uncertain, fixing the last gate together. Their hands brushed once on the same length of wire, a small accidental spark. Neither pulled away. When Widow Perkins returned from town, she found them there, mud to their knees, quiet laughter between them like the hush after prayer. She watched from the fence line, smiled to herself, and went inside without a word. Inside, supper was simple stew reheated from the night before, bread warmed over the fire. Samuel ate, little eyes distant. Emma caught him studying the window more than once, the road beyond it. "Tilman's gone," she said. "For now." "For now," he agreed. "But men like him don't vanish. They wait till dark." "Then what will you do?" "Same thing I did in the war," he said. "Stand between the trouble and whoever can't fight back." She set her spoon down gently. "And who stands between you and it?" He looked surprised, as though the question had never occurred to him. "Guess I hadn't thought that far." "Then think," she said softly. "Because if you keep carrying everyone else's storms, you'll drown before you see the next sunrise." He gave a short, rueful laugh. "You don't mince words either." "Must be the school teacher in me." Something in that moment, her tone, the small crease at the corner of her mouth, eased the air. The tension that had wound tight since Tilman's arrival loosened, leaving only weariness. Night fell early, a kind of bruised twilight that turned the town's lamps into small, fragile moons. Widow Perkins retired upstairs with her Bible and a muttered good night, leaving them alone in the parlor. Emma sat near the fire, mending a tear in her shawl. Samuel cleaned the mud from his boots, his movements methodical, the scrape of his knife against leather the only sound. "Did you ever think," she said without looking up, "that maybe that letter wasn't a mistake at all?" He paused. "How so? Maybe it just took the long road through both our lives before it reached the right hands." He leaned back, studying her. The firelight flickered across his face, catching in the pale scar at his temple. "If that's true," he said slowly, "then I owe the storm a thank you." She smiled faintly. Maybe just a quiet one. It might hear. They shared a silence that wasn't empty, but full of small understanding. After a while, Samuel said, "You ever think about leaving this place, heading east again sometimes? But the east is full of ghosts that don't know they're dead." He nodded. Out here, they at least have room to ride. The clock ticked steady and unhurried. When she finally rose to go upstairs, he stood too. "I'll be keeping watch tonight," he said. "Because of Tilman. Because of peace," he said simply. "It's easier to protect when it's quiet." She wanted to argue, but the way he said it, calm final, made her only nod. "Good night, Mr. Reed. Good night, Miss Whitaker." Sometime after midnight, a sound woke her, a soft knock, not on the door, but on the window pane. Rain again, light as breath. She went to the sill, half expecting to see his shadow outside, but the yard was empty. The air shimmered with moonlight on wet ground. Downstairs, she could hear the creak of a chair, a faint murmur, his voice. Perhaps talking to the horse, or to himself, or to ghosts. She lay back down, but sleep didn't come. Her mind replayed the moment on the porch, his words about building shelter, the way his eyes had softened when he said we. By morning, the rain had stopped again. The sky was pale gold, streaked with thin clouds. Widow Perkins had gone early to the market, leaving a note and a pot of porridge on the stove. Samuel was outside chopping wood. Each swing of the axe was measured precise. Emma stood in the doorway watching him until he noticed her. "Breakfast's ready," she called. He set the axe aside and came toward her, wiping his hands on a rag. The air between them felt different, now steady, grounded like the earth after rain. As they ate, conversation came easily. The school children's progress, the state of the fence, the early thaw on the ridge. Normal things, but beneath them something quieter, hummed trust perhaps, or its beginning. When she gathered the dishes, he said, "Suddenly I was thinking of riding out to the homestead tomorrow. The roof needs patching before the next storm. You'll need help." He looked up. "You offering, if you'll have it." A ghost of amusement touched his face. "I always thought school teachers were sensible folk. Then it's time you learned otherwise." That afternoon they prepared supplies for the ride rope, oilcloth, a small sack of flour. Widow Perkins insisted they take. The widow watched them load the saddlebags with a look that was part suspicion, part approval. "Storms find folks for a reason," she said finally, eyes twinkling. "Sometimes just to make them stop running." Neither Emma nor Samuel answered. They set out the next morning, the land still slick with dew. The trail wound through low country past cottonwoods and the remnants of old campfires. The silence between them was companionable. The horses' hooves made soft music on damp soil. Samuel pointed out the ridge ahead. "Homestead's beyond that rise. Small place but solid. Built it myself after the war. Alone for a while. Then a neighbor helped with the roof. He's gone now, Kansas maybe." Emma shaded her eyes against the Sunday. "Seems a hard life. Better than an empty one." When they reached the cabin, it stood quiet among the aspens. A single chimney porch, sagging slightly smoke-blackened window panes. The place smelled of pine of memory. He pushed the door open. Dust motes swirled in the light. "This was your home," she said softly. "Still is, I suppose. Just been waiting on someone to open the windows." Together they swept out the dust, patched the roof, and brought air back into the rooms. It felt almost sacred, 2 lives mending what time and weather had worn thin. Near dusk rain began again, gentle and steady drumming on the new shingles like applause. Samuel lit a lamp, its glow spilling over the table. "Shelter enough for tonight," he said. Emma smiled, watching the reflection of the flame in his eyes. More than enough. They ate bread and beans by the fire, the kind of meal that tasted better for being shared. Outside, thunder rolled far away. Not a threat now, just a reminder of how close danger and comfort could live together. When she turned to look at him, he was already watching her. The lamplight softened the hard planes of his face, revealing something unguarded. "Funny thing," he said quietly. "A letter, a storm, a mistake in the post, and somehow it all leads here." "Maybe that's what shelter means," she said. "Finding the place where all the wrong turns finally make sense." He nodded, then stood and held out his hand, not as a claim, but as an invitation. "Then stay until morning." She placed her hand in his. The warmth there was steady, honest, like the light on the table. Nothing promised everything possible. Outside, the rain kept falling, soft, endless, and kind, sinking into the earth that would remember it come spring. And in that small cabin beneath the ridge, two people who had once written to strangers finally found what they'd been asking for all along: shelter, trust, and bond. The sun came back cruelly bright after the rain, light hard enough to peel secrets from wood and skin alike. Whispering pines glistened under it all, mud turned to dust again, the town pretending nothing had happened. But memory, like rust, doesn't wash away. Samuel Reed rose early. He'd spent half the night turning over Widow Perkins's spare hammer in his hands, thinking of Emma Whitaker's face in the firelight, and the letter that had traveled the long road from his past to her palm. By dawn, he'd made his decision. When he knocked at her cottage door, she was already up, hair pinned neatly, sleeves rolled, broom in hand. She opened the door and frowned as if she'd been expecting bad news. "You came early. I work better before the town wakes. You planning to build something, Mr. Reed, maybe," he said. "A fence. Or a future. Not sure which yet." Her smile was wary, but it reached her eyes this time. They worked side by side through the morning, patching the porch railing, setting a new hinge on the gate, mending what men and weather had broken. There were few words between them, but a rhythm formed anyway. The scrape of wood, the strike of nail, the soft exchange of breath. Dates on the calendars of their separate lives turned quietly to the same page. At midday, they paused by the well behind the house. Emma drew water, the bucket creaking as it rose. Samuel offered his cup, and she filled it halfway, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. Neither pulled away. "You always this quiet when you work?" she asked. "Talking don't make the boards straighter." "Maybe not. But it keeps the ghosts from joining in." He looked at her sharply, then nodded. "Fair point." A meadowlark whistled from the cottonwood beyond the fence. Somewhere down the lane, a wagon rattled over a rut, and a boy called to a dog. Ordinary sounds. Daylight, the old doctor said once, was medicine for fear. In the afternoon, the marshal rode out from town, dust trailing behind his horse like smoke. He dismounted at Emma's gate, eyeing the two of them with the weary amusement of a man who's seen every kind of trouble twice. "Morning, Miss Whitaker." "Reed." Marshal Samuel greeted. "Word is Tilman's been stirring up his men again," the marshal said. "I'll keep an eye on him, but you might want to be careful after dark." Samuel's jaw tightened. "I'll handle it." "I'm sure you will," the marshal said mildly. "But don't go looking for trouble. Out here it tends to find you first." When he was gone, Emma looked at Samuel. "You think he's right about Tilman?" He shrugged. "Men like him don't quit till something stops them. Then maybe it's time he met someone who doesn't scare easy," she said. There was fire in her voice. Now not defiance, but conviction, and Samuel felt it catch somewhere deep inside him. They finished the gate by late afternoon. The hinge took true. The latch fell clean. He stepped back and tested it with a single push. Solid. A small thing, but small things hold houses together. "Looks like it remembers how to behave," Emma said. "Most things do once you give 'em purpose." Evening crept in slow and red, the kind of light that made everything seem honest. They sat on the steps, too tired to talk, listening to the crickets begin their song. Wind moved through the grass, bending it all in one direction, a single breath across the land. Samuel finally said, "You ever think about leaving this place I used to? When it felt like the world was small enough to run from. And now I think the world's the same everywhere. just waiting for someone to stand still long enough to belong to it. He turned that over like a coin. You make belonging sound easy. It isn't. But it's worth it. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the exhaustion behind his calm, the lines carved not by age, but by solitude. He'd been standing between storms and other people's doors for a long time. The body keeps score. "Samuel," she said softly, "why did you really come to Whispering Pines?" He hesitated. "Supplies, at first. Then, you." The words landed between them, simple, unadorned, dangerous. Emma didn't move. The air felt charged, as though the same lightning that had split the sky days ago was now quietly burning beneath their skin. "You hardly know me," she whispered. "Then tell me," he said. "Tell me what makes you stay, what keeps you fighting, what scares you." She looked down at her hands. "I'm scared of losing what little I've built, of being someone's charity, of needing anyone." He reached out slow enough that she could refuse, and took her hand. His touch was warm, steady. "Then let's make it not charity. Let's make it choice." Night came. The lamplight inside her cottage painted the walls gold. They shared coffee instead of whiskey, silence instead of promises. There's a way two people can sit together that makes words unnecessary, the heart explaining itself in the distance between two cups. Emma stood by the window, looking out at the ridge where his ranch lay hidden in darkness. "You said you live alone up there." "I do. Doesn't it get cold every winter?" "And lonely?" He gave a faint smile. "Less now." When she turned, her hair caught the light, soft as candle flame. He stepped closer. She didn't retreat. The space between them vanished like breath on glass. He brushed his thumb along her jaw, a gesture more reverent than bold. "You should go," she murmured, though her voice betrayed her. Should he agreed? "But I won't." Their first kiss was quiet, unhurried, as if neither wanted to startle the moment into ending. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines like a witness unwilling to speak. Time learned a new pace and kept it. They broke apart only when a horse's distant whinny snapped the world back into motion. Samuel's hand dropped to his revolver out of habit. "Tilman?" she asked. "Maybe? Or just night playing tricks?" He took a step back, gathering himself. "Lock your door tonight. I'll stay close." "Close out back, in the barn." She frowned. "That's hardly comfortable." "I've slept in worse places," he said. Before he turned to go, she caught his sleeve. "Samuel, thank you." "For what?" "For staying." He tipped his hat, the ghost of a smile on his lips. Didn't have anywhere better to be. That night, she lay awake listening to the low hum of wind through the cracks, the steady rhythm of rain starting again, and faint but sure, the sound of a man breathing in the barn. She realized she no longer felt alone. Not safe exactly, but seen. Outside, the dust that had settled all day began to lift again, whispering across the plains like the first promise of something larger than fear. The next days wore the same face work in the bright hours, caution in the dark. Trust does not fall like rain. It's laid board by board until a roof holds. At the schoolhouse, Emma taught her pupils under a square of clean sky multiplication tables penmanship, a map of the territories chalked across the board. She kept her letters small and careful the way life demanded out here. During recess, she watched the older boys avoid the fence line, where the wire hummed wind making a moan of it. She set 2 of them to cleaning slates, sent a girl home early with a fever, rewove the ribbon in a little one's braid. The work steadied her, gave shape to the hours. Samuel watched the town from its edges. He had a way of appearing just when a thing needed doing and disappearing before thanks found him. He shored up Mrs. Donnelly's porch, reshoot a mule for a drunk who didn't deserve it, helped the blacksmith lever a stubborn wagon wheel back onto its hub. He slept little. The weight he carried wasn't visible, but a man could see its outline where his shoulders met his shirt. On the 3rd evening, a storm rose without rain, a windstorm dust lashing in from the flats, the sky, the color of old bruises. Emma latched her shutters and set a pan of water by the door for anyone who might knock. Samuel came in, with his hat pulled low, and the news that Tilman had been seen at the Silver Spur, with 3 men who laughed, like they didn't mind breaking things that weren't theirs. Marshall's watching, Samuel said. But the marshal sleeps sometimes. And you don't, she asked. Sleep's a habit, he said. I've been trying to break it. He checked the windows, the door, the back latch. When he finished, he stood in the center of the room as if listening to the house itself. You can hear a stranger in a quiet place, he said. Floorboards talk when feet don't belong. They waited a candle, making a brave circle of light on the table. Wind climbed the walls and scraped its nails on the roof. After a while, Emma poured coffee and set bread by his elbow. Eat, she said. Trust isn't just a word. It's a loaf. It gets made. He smiled with only half his mouth, which was the most he knew how. Yes, ma'am. The knock, when it came, was soft, too soft. Not the widow, not a neighbor. Samuel's eyes met hers and held. He lifted a finger to his lips. Who is it? Emma called, voice steady. Silence. Then a man's drawl. Even in school, marm. Tilman sent me to fetch a book he left you. We're closed, she said. Come back tomorrow. I think I'll come in now, the voice said, pleasant as creek water over knives. The latch moved. The door held. Samuel stepped to the side of the frame hand already on his Colt. You sure you want to learn manners this way? He asked the wood. No harm meant, the voice said. Just saying hello. Samuel opened the door fast, and Lowe pulled the man off balance and introduced him to the hard truth of a floorboard. Another figure came from the left. Emma moved quicker than thought, threw the pan of water in his eyes, slammed the door with her hip, and grabbed the broom like a pike. The second man cursed and flailed. Samuel's pistol found the first one's teeth and encouraged silence. Outside, a third set of bootsteps retreated into the wind. Tell Tilman he's mistaken about the kind of house this is, Samuel said, calm and cold, and about the kind of woman. The men stumbled off into the night with blood in their mouths and dust in their pride. Samuel watched the darkness swallow them, then shut the door quietly and set the latch. Emma realized she was shaking only when she tried to put the broom back and missed the peg. He took it gently from her hand and hung it straight. You did fine, he said. She let out a breath that seemed to empty a year. I threw water on a man with a gun. Best use of water I've seen in a month. She laughed, then sharp and watery. You're bleeding, she said, seeing the line of red along his knuckles where his fist had met a bad man's jaw. He looked at his hand like it belonged to someone else. It's not an argument I'll lose sleep over. She fetched a basin whiskey, a clean cloth, and a scrap of linen. He sat obediently, big and quiet, while she worked the way the land sits for weather. It knows it can't fight. She cleaned the split and bound it with care her grandmother would have approved. When she finished, he flexed his fingers and winced with satisfaction. You ever been looked after? She asked, without thinking. He shook his head. Not by anyone who meant it. Well, she said, and the word held a promise, consider yourself practiced on. Wind fell off toward midnight. The house remembered how to be still. Emma banked the fire. Samuel took the chair by the door hat, tilted over his eyes, but sleep far away. Before she went to her room, she touched his shoulder lightly, a thank. You a good night, a bridge built without planks. He sat there a long time after the warmth of her hand, finding places the fire couldn't reach. Morning came with the quiet relief that follows a night unbroken by hoofbeats. The town wore a smug look, like a gambler who'd gotten away with a lie. Emma stepped onto the porch and breathed the clean-edged air. Samuel was already in the yard, rolling the soreness from his shoulder, checking the scuff marks where boots had gone where they shouldn't. Widow Perkins arrived with cinnamon bread and opinions. Heard the ruckus, she said, setting the loaf on the table like a gavel. Marshall says he'll make Tilman choose between a cell and a road out of town if there's more of it. There'll be more, Samuel said. There usually is, the widow agreed. But trouble gets bored when it can't make a home. Keep your place in order. Keep your people close. She eyed the two of them and added, gentler, storms don't last. Folks do. After the widow left, Emma brought out a small tin box from her room. Inside lay a ribbon the color of faded sky and the letter that had started this new weather in their lives. I want to keep it here, she said, placing the letterbox on a shelf by the door. Not hidden, not flaunted, just where a person keeps things that change how they breathe. Samuel looked at the box, then at her. All right. Say something honest, she said suddenly. Not brave, not polite, honest. He took his time as if words were nails that needed aiming. I wake up each day and don't know whether I've earned the right to want more than quiet. Then I see you, and want ain't a sin anymore. The answer found her unguarded. She stepped closer without meaning to. My turn, she said. I was afraid the only thing that would ever find me in this town was the past. Then you knocked on my door, and the future started sounding less like a story I told the children and more like something I might read for myself. They didn't kiss then. They let the words stand and hold. Trust asks its price. It came due on a Sunday when the sky was a flawless blue and church bells pretended they could keep wolves from the door. Emma walked the boardwalk after service with her girls in their best bows trailing beside her and found Tilman leaning against a post outside the Mercantile, his face a study in borrowed swagger. Morning school, marm, he said, as if the night had been a joke they'd all enjoyed together. Two of his men stood flanking him, and the town's eyes did what they do, they watched and didn't. Mr. Tilman, she said, easy as a woman greeting weather she'd already decided how to dress for. You got a pretty way of saying no, he said, but a man prefers yes in the end. A man might learn the value of no, she answered, if he lives long enough. His smile thin. You ain't married, he said loudly enough for the church ladies to hear. Shame a woman alone. People start to wonder where her protection is. Samuel's shadow fell across Tilman before his voice did. She's got it. Tilman turned the showman greeting a rival actor on stage. Afternoon read. Heard you like sitting in ladies' barns. Can't tell if that's gallant or just foolish. Samuel's eyes stayed steady. You're done here. Tilman's hand drifted near his belt, not to his gun, but not away either. You gonna make me leave a public street, no? Samuel said. You're gonna make yourself leave, because you've got enough sense left to know trouble when it stands up straight. For a long breath the air went thin. Then the marshal's voice came from the edge of the crowd, dry as sun-bleached bone. Frank, that road you were considering, I'd start walking it. Tilman weighed the weather spat purely for punctuation and tipped his hat at Emma like courtesy could erase a bruise. Later then he muttered and sauntered off with his men. The town's gaze tugged behind him like a torn sleeve. The marshal watched him go, then turned to Samuel. I said, don't go looking. I didn't, Samuel said. He found me, like always. The marshal grunted. Get her home. And read. The next time this happens it won't be talk. I know, Samuel said. Emma had stood still through it all, hands calm at her sides. Voice saved for when it might matter more. Only when they were 3 streets away did she let the breath out. I hate giving him our steps, she said. You didn't, Samuel said. You gave them back to yourself. That night, the two of them walked the fence line behind the cottage with lanterns. Moths flung themselves at the glass, like ideas not thought through. Samuel stopped by the gate they'd mended and rested his palm on the smooth new board. What do you want this place to be, he asked. Mine, she said at once, then added, ours, when we're standing in it together. Then we'll make it, that he said. Slow and plain and good. Will you teach me the ridge, she asked suddenly. The trail, the way storms move there, the places where a person can be seen or not. Yes. And will you let me teach you my classroom how to stack books so a small hand finds them, how to read a child's eyes before his mouth gets him in trouble? He smiled. Yes. They traded lessons for the rest of the week. On Monday he showed her where to cross Bitter Creek without losing a boot. On Tuesday she taught him to tie clean ribbon bows that stayed through recess. Wednesday they set posts in wet ground and talked about what people owed each other. Thursday they ate stew with too much salt and laughed so hard the widow came to the door just to smile. Friday they said nothing and said everything anyway, the way folks do who have stopped pretending they're alone. On Saturday Samuel took her up the ridge trail at first light. The world below them lay like a folded map. He pointed out the cuts and draws the way wind told the truth before clouds decided to. When the wire sings, he said, rain's not far. When it screams, get low. You speak storm fluent, she said. I learned because I had to, he answered. I keep learning because I want to. They reached his cabin just as the day leaned toward noon. The roof they'd patched held clean against a passing squall, and the porch swept and straightened looked like a welcome made of boards. Inside, he lit a small fire against the damp and set coffee to boil. She wandered to the window and touched the still-old grain polished by years of palms. "It's a good place," she said. "It's better now," he said. He took the letter from his pocket, the one she'd found, the one that had walked from Rollins to Whispering Pines by way of their lives, and set it on the table between them. "Let's stop letting this be an accident," he said. Her eyes lifted to his. "What do you want it to be?" "A beginning," he said. "That's all I can warn, honest." "Honest is enough," she said. They didn't kiss then either. They let the future listen. Trust's last test came the way these things do, without announcement, in the space between ordinary moments. They were riding back toward town at dusk, the path narrowed by rocks and new growth, when a shot cracked the air to their right. A puff of dust jumped near Samuel's stirrup. He pulled Emma's horse behind his and wheeled both into the shelter of a low rise. "Stay," he said, and slid off his saddle like a whisper. The second shot came wild. The shooter was angry, not careful. Samuel moved toward it like a man walking to the end of a job he'd already decided to finish. Emma held the reins tight and stared at a scrub juniper 10 yards ahead. Wind moved through it from behind, wrong for the weather. A man hides like a badly told lie. Something always points the truth's way. She looped. The reins slid down, picked up a rock the size of a fist, and flung it to the left. The ambusher turned his face toward the sound. Samuel stepped up from the right, took the man's gun wrist in a grip that had ended wars before, and used the earth to make his point. "Tilman send you?" he asked the dust. The man swore, which was a kind of yes. Samuel looked to Emma. "You all right?" She nodded. He offered her his hand, and she took it. He stacked her back into the saddle as if she were made of something both strong and worth keeping. They delivered the man to the marshal with the same lack of ceremony with which a person returns a broken tool. Time for that road, the marshal told Tilman an hour later, when the man himself was found drunk and bragging. "You can take it on your horse or on your feet. You don't get to choose both." Tilman made a speech about rights and manhood, and the West answered like it always does, with a flat stare and a clear horizon. By dawn, he was gone. Maybe not forever. Men like him grow back in other soils, but gone enough for the town to breathe without checking its mirror. Samuel and Emma walked out into the first clean light together. The street was just a street again. The church bell practiced forgiveness. The blacksmith sang off-key. Widow Perkins waved a dish towel like a flag of surrender to joy. "Seems odd," Emma said, "how ordinary happiness looks." "Better than the other kind," Samuel said. They stood by the letter box on her porch, the tin lid bright from rain and thumb. She opened it, set the letter inside its small, honest place, and closed it with a click that sounded like a promise only they needed to hear. "What are we?" she asked, not to trap him, but to give him the open ground of truth. "We're two people who didn't run," he said. "And if we keep not running, we'll be home." She took his hand. The grip wasn't tight, only true. The sun, uncruel for once, laid a clean stripe of light across the boards they'd set together. The wind moved through the pines, not warning now, but blessing. Trust and bond are built, not found. They built, and the town which remembers everything and tells only what it must began, to add their story to its quiet, accurate ledger. The one kept in fences that hold and letters that arrive, and 2 chairs that learn each other's weight by heart. Threet. The next dawn carried the smell of smoke, thin, distant, uncertain. Samuel Reed woke in the barn, the gray mare shifting beside him. He lay still, listening. Wind, or trouble pretending to be wind. The quiet had an edge to it, like a blade laid flat on the tongue. He rose without a word, palmed the rifle he kept by the stall, and stepped outside. The yard was washed pearl and blue, every droplet from last night's mist catching the pale light like a bead. Yet something in the air was wrong too, held as if the world itself had paused for a thought it didn't want to finish. Down the road, Whispering Pines slept under a veil of early morning. The church bell hadn't yet found its breath. The blacksmith's forge sat cold as a shut mouth. Above the false front roofs, a faint thread of ash-colored smoke uncoiled and thinned into the sky. Inside the cottage, Emma Whitaker had not slept. She'd been marking student papers by lamplight, the red pencil biting gentle corrections into the margins. When the barn door clicked and his boots crossed the yard, she knew it was him by the weight of the step's purpose, without hurry. He filled the doorway like a question. The lamplight made a gold rim of his shoulders. "Something's burning," she asked. He nodded once. "East of town near the livery. Could be a stove kicked over. Could be Tilman." She rose, gathering her shawl with fingers that remembered last night's steadiness. "If it's Tilman, then I'll handle it." "Samuel," she said sharply, the schoolteacher, snapping a ruler across recklessness, "don't turn this into a gunfight." He met her eyes. Sometimes the fight turns itself. She saw it then, the quiet steel beneath his calm. Not bluster, not temper, just a man who'd spent too long surviving, shaping his days around the hard facts of weather hunger and other men. They rode in together, the mare's hooves muffled on damp earth, the chill morning peeling breath from their mouths. Whispering Pines looked almost peaceful at a distance, smokestacks thin as pencil lines, window panes catching first light, but as they neared the truth, met them with a sharper scent, kerosene. The old feed shed behind Holcomb's store had gone black on one wall and smoldered along the roofline. A bucket line had been pulled in the dark hours, muddy footprints, a dropped bonnet, a child's tin cup repurposed badly as a pail. The flare had been small, the rain their ally, but messages do not need to be large to be read. A small crowd had gathered: shopkeepers, ranch hands, the banker who never liked to be surprised by anything, and the marshal himself, hat pulled low against the thin glare. "Reed," the marshal called when he saw them. "Whitaker." "What happened?" Samuel asked, sliding from the saddle. "Somebody doused the place in lamp oil after midnight." The marshal squinted at the blackened boards like they might confess. "Didn't spread far. Rain helped, but it's a message." Samuel's jaw found that set of his that made fewer words do more work. "Tilman." "Can't prove it," the marshal said. "He was seen drinking with two drifters who ain't built for an honest day's wage. One of 'em bought rope and bullets yesterday. Always a bad combination." Emma stepped closer, skirts brushing ash. "You'll arrest him, I need evidence," the marshal answered, and his voice had the grit of a man who hated saying so. "And witnesses, willing to talk." "So far, I got neither." Emma looked at Samuel then, and for the first time she noticed the quiet calculation in his expression, the soldier measuring angles, exits, and the distance between wrong and right, when law stood blindfolded by lack of proof. "Don't," she whispered. "Please." "I'm just thinking," he said. The feed shed hissed itself back toward silence. The town, with the stubbornness of places that outlast their own mistakes, began to pry itself into the motions of morning. But the smell of smoke stuck to everything, a taste on the back of the tongue you couldn't swallow down. By afternoon, the sun wore a flat face. People did their business with voices pitched too high, as if joking made truth smaller. Samuel brought the gray mare out again, and the leather creaked, the sound of decisions. "I'll ride north," he said, adjusting the saddle. "See if Tilman's at his place." Emma stepped into the gate and put her palm to the mare's chest. "You think marching up to him alone will solve anything?" "I think not marching up there lets him believe he can light the next match," he said. "A man like that prospers on other folks waiting." She folded her arms, stubborn as fence posts, sunk deep. "Then I'm coming with you. You're not. I am." The look they traded had distances in it, and roads, and that narrow place where pride and care wrestle without blood. Samuel sighed, not the sigh of defeat, but the kind a man gives when he recognizes an equal's ground. "You ever fired a gun?" he asked. "My father taught me," she said, "and I've practiced since." He nodded. The truth in her voice was the kind you could set a kettle on. "All right, schoolteacher. Stay behind me, and if things go wrong, you ride for town." "Things already went wrong the day he decided I was something to own," she said. "I'm finished letting other people write my ending." They rode under a sky the color of old pewter, the pines combing sound from the air. The trail to Tilman's place wound through red clay gullies still damp at their throats. Birds flushed when they passed, then settled again when the land recognized who it was choosing to ignore. At the ridge, Samuel dismounted and handed her the reins. "Wait here." She shook her head. "Not a chance." "Emma, If you walk into his yard alone, you give him a reason to shoot on sight. Two of us might give him pause if only because he won't know which story to invent." He almost smiled at her nerve. "You argue like someone born west of the Mississippi. Then it's working." Tilman's cabin sat crooked among the trees, like it had learned posture from the man who built it. Smoke rose from the chimney in a stingy line. One horse stood tied out front, two more in the scrub shade. 3 men then, unless the math was meant to lie. Samuel's fingers brushed the holster at his hip, a touch more of habit than promise. "Stay behind me," he said again. She moved to his right shoulder, which wasn't what he'd meant, but he let it be. They stepped into the open. You could feel the air notice. Tilman came to the porch, slowly, arms still bound from the bullet that had torn through him days ago. He wore a grin like a scar, slow, shiny, and proud of itself. "Well, if it ain't the schoolmarm and her hired gun," he drawled. "You two just can't stay out of my business." "Your business burned half the feed shed last night," Samuel said evenly. "We figured we'd return the courtesy without the fire." Tilman laughed, the kind of sound that wants an audience and won't admit it. "You got nerve, Reed. I'll give you that. But you're trespassing, and my patience is short." He cocked his head toward the dark inside. "Clyde Amos, bring the rifles." Samuel's voice dropped a tone the war had taught him for moments like this. "Emma, get back." She didn't move. 2 men slid from the shadow, the first with a scar like a misplaced smile, the second with eyes that wouldn't pick a direction and stay with it. The rifles looked well-loved and poorly maintained, which is a cruel combination. Samuel counted barrels, angles wind, and the stubborn fact of Emma's shoulder warm at his sleeve. He'd faced worse odds. He'd never done it with something behind him that could be broken by his failure. "Don't do this," he said to Tilman. "You'll hang for it." Tilman sneered. "Hangin's for poor men. I got friends." The world snapped. Tilman's hand twitched toward his gun. Samuel's Colt was already clearing leather. He didn't think so much as remember. One shot to bite the ground at Tilman's boots, message not murder. The next snapped the rifle from Clyde's hands with a scream of wood and skin. Amos fired wild. Bark exploded near Emma's hip. She did not flinch. Samuel pivoted, fired, and Amos's shoulder jerked back. The rifle fell. Through cordite stink and needle burn, they found the stillness that comes after an honest choice. When the haze cleared, Amos lay breathing, hard blood boiling bright between his fingers. Clyde had vanished down the tree line, leaving a thread of curses to stitch his path. Tilman stood hatless and pale beneath his sun-browned swagger disbelief, pulling his Adam's apple up and down like a pump. "You're fast," he croaked. "Faster than you think," Samuel said. He kicked the dropped rifle aside, stepped forward until the barrel of his Colt had a quiet conversation with the space near Tilman's throat, and let his eyes say the rest. "Ride into town," Samuel ordered. "Turn yourself in. You so much as look back, I'll finish what I started last week. And I'll sleep just fine." Tilman's gaze skipped Samuel's gun, Emma's unblinking face, the blood on his own sleeve, and something in him faltered, a gear grinding without teeth. He spat, grabbed his horse, and rode off through the pines. Rage trailed behind him like smoke, visible, choking, but already thinning. Silence put its mouth back on the clearing. Samuel lowered his weapon. The muscle in his forearm trembled not from fear, but from the kind of restraint that costs more than violence. He turned to Emma then, and in the stillness found her where she had been, white-faced, steady, alive. "You all right?" he asked. "I think so." She took inventory, hands, ribs, breath. "You could have killed him." "I wanted to," he said the truth, quiet. "But I'm trying to be a better man than I was back then." Her eyes softened the way water takes the shape of a wound and cleans it. "You are." They bound Amos's shoulder with a strip of Tilman's own curtain, small justice, properly applied, and shoved him onto the least lame of the horses. The ride back smelled of pine sap, hot metal, and the particular sorrow of men who mistake loyalty for employment. By the time they reached town, the marshal had organized his face into law again. Samuel handed over his revolver without being asked. "Tilman started it. I finished it. Looks like restraint, not murder," the marshal said, after the quick, competent ritual of squinting at powder marks and thumbprint. I'll take it from here. Emma watched the lawman ride off to gather a posse. The town exhaled, but the air felt thinner than it had at dawn. You didn't have to protect me, she said quietly when they were alone by the hitching post. I didn't do it for you, he answered, then added, softer. Not only for you. They stood in the settling dust eyes, refusing to learn the trick of looking away. Night returned with a false gentleness, as if the day had learned something and would now behave. Widow Perkins's parlor wore lamplight like a good shawl. Emma sat by the window, the rifle across Samuel's knees, reflecting a small, honest glow as he cleaned it. Brass clicked. Oiled cloth murmured. His hands moved as if remembering an older song and making it decent. Do you think he'll come back, she asked. Tilman, maybe. Men like him always think they're owed another chance. And what then? Then we end it, he said simply. She studied him in profile, the hard line of jaw, the quiet kept under his words like a basement storing storms. You talk like you've been ending things your whole life. He paused, then met her gaze. Until now. Something like a smile moved through the room without stopping. Outside, the wind fell silent in the trees. Too silent. The pines of this country gossip. When they decide not to, a person should listen to the silence instead. Emma set her cup down. Hear that Samuel did. He stood, crossed to the window, and lifted the curtain with 2 fingers. Far off past the livery and the blacksmith's, a low orange shimmer licked at the dark, not yet tall enough to announce itself with flames. Smoke came thin and sour. The smell this time was not accident. It was intent. Schoolhouse Emma breathed, already moving. Samuel caught her arm. If it's burning, it's bait. He knows you'll run to it. Then he knows me, she said, and her eyes had the particular kind of fire that eats back. Then he knows me too, Samuel said, and let go. They went out the back, not the front. The widow's yard opened onto a narrow alley where barrels slept, and cats held their counsels. Samuel handed Emma the shorter shotgun and kept the Colt. The rifle would be too slow at the ranges that fate was likely to choose. Wind barely moved. The earth seemed to be waiting for its own verdict. They cut along the backs of buildings, keeping to shadows. The schoolhouse sat near the edge of town, close enough to wear Sunday clothes, far enough to raise its voice, without scaring the shopkeepers. As they came around the corner of the mercantile, heat licked their cheeks. A small blaze crawled along the porch rail of the school, greedy and bright, fed by a trail of kerosene snaking from a spilled can. Samuel veered to the pump, set the handle racing, and filled the rain barrel till it sang. Emma yanked the burning rail free with the hook they kept for such visits from fate, dragged it into the road, and smothered the kerosene tongue with wet burlap. Fire complains loudly when it is denied. This one cursed out, sputtered, and went to sulk along the edges of damp wood. That was their distraction, Samuel said, scanning the dark. Where's the gunfire? Answered from the black between the livery and the tanners. The first shot slapped the pump handle. The second chewed splinters from the schoolhouse door. The third went to ground a lesson in how fear throws a man's aim wide when surety abandons him. 2, Samuel said. Maybe 3. East Alley. He pointed Emma to the corner of the porch where the view narrowed and the angle favored defense. Count to 10. Then put 1 high above their heads. Let them learn we're not blind. She nodded, settled, breathed. At 10, the shotgun barked, and the night jumped. A curse came back, and the sound of a boot knocking tin. In the same heartbeat, Samuel slid cat-quiet along the school's side, found the darker dark of the alley, and waited for the man who always runs to where he thinks the last thing he ruined is hiding. The first figure rushed past hat-low shoulders, hunched into wrong. Samuel stepped behind him, hooked an ankle, and introduced the man to the ground with appointed civility. The second rushed after the first and learned from example. He moved sideways, firing blind. The bullet took a bite from the school bell's rope and made it sing faintly, a note like warning and like prayer. Emma leaned out and put her next shot into the dirt, a yard from his toes. Some men can read. He did. He dropped the gun, hands up. Tilman, Samuel called into the dark. This is where you stop. The answer came from the street, not the alley, a smart man's choice, or a coward's, sometimes the same road. Tilman stepped from shadow lamplight from the general store, finding his face and making an argument for the ugliness of certain kinds of confidence. "You ain't the law," he said, voice even. "No," Samuel agreed. "But I'm the reason you still got a law to turn yourself over to." A silence fell that wasn't empty. Windows bristled with eyes. A door opened and did not close. The marshal's boots began to explain the nature of authority from somewhere behind the church. Emma from the porch spoke without shaking. "You set fire to a school. That's a spineless thing to do, even for a man like you." Tilman's smile wrinkled wrong. "Houses matter to folks. You burn one, they remember to be afraid. We remember to be angry," she said. He shifted his weight, and Samuel saw it, the tiny tell that always comes before a bad idea tries to become history. "Don't," Samuel said. Tilman reached. Two sounds happened, a single pistol crack, and the clean bell tone of the school's small iron voice finding the night. For a heartbeat, it was impossible to say which sound was louder or which ruled the air. Then Tilman's gun spun from his hand, the shot gone to God, and Samuel's second bullet kicked dust near his boot heel on purpose. "Live with your courage, Frank," Samuel said, Colt steady. "Walk toward the marshal." "I'll come back," Tilman hissed, clutching his hand. "I'll come back with men who ain't made of smoke," Emma supplied. "You're made of smoke tonight." He took a step. The marshal's voice arrived with the step's end. "That's enough," he said, and this time the law wore its full height. Deputies fanned. Ropes and iron and the useful boredom of bureaucracy closed in. One of Tilman's hired men started a speech and found a fist instead. It should have ended there. But rage has a memory, and pride carries pockets for matches. From somewhere past the tanners a hiss, a flare, a bottle arcing. The lamp oil found the mercantile's awning and climbed it quick. Someone screamed fire, with all the poetry fear ever needs. The street's quiet exploded into the old wild, that animal in towns that still remembers how to run in every direction at once. Samuel swore once cleanly and without flourish. "Buckets," he barked. "Form a line." The marshal, to his credit, shouted the same, which made sense to men whose instinct was to listen to either survival or authority. Widow Perkins appeared with her washtub like a saint with a basin. Boys hauled water like absolution. Women passed buckets and commanded men to be useful. The church bell rang not for service now, but for sense. Emma left her post and sprinted for the mercantile. Fire had ambitions always larger than its own hands. It licked across canvas, nosed into tar, and found the edges of letters painted with the town's name. Samuel caught up to her with 2 paces and thrust a wet blanket into her arms. "Top edge," he said. "Smother from the wind side." They worked at the front, while the marshal's men hauled Tilman back from the temptation to use chaos for opportunity. The air turned red and hot and smoky sweet with ruin. A boy tripped. Emma dragged him by his collar clear of a falling ember. Samuel climbed the awning support, braced one boot, and laid the wet over the worst of it. Steam shouted. Then the flame found itself less certain and sulked again. It took 10 minutes that lasted a lifetime. Then the fire lost its appetite. Water, sweat, and stubbornness do that to monsters. Smoke wrote itself thinner. The mercantile stood scorched, but standing the town a mess of men with blistered hands, women with streaked faces, and a marshal who would rather fill out paperwork than coffins. Tilman watched it all with a look like arithmetic that won't add the way a man wants. When the irons finally bit his wrists, he looked at Samuel like a mirror he wished would lie. "You think this ends me," he spat. "I think this ends you here," Samuel said. "And that's all I need." They took him then through the street that would remember this night by the milk pail lines of steam and the smell of rope that didn't get used for evil this time. His men went quiet under the long hand of consequence. The town stood around the whole trouble leaves when it has been pulled through. Later, when the buckets were forgotten and the last smoky trickles wrote gray scars down black boards, Emma sat on the schoolhouse steps and looked at her hands. The skin was lined with ash. The cuts were small but real. Samuel came and sat beside her, not touching, sharing a silence that felt like the kind a person earns. "You didn't let it take the school," he said. "We didn't let it," she corrected. He nodded. "We." She lifted her face then, and in the tired gold of the waning lamp she looked more alive than she ever had in any parlor with a curtained window. "You said we'd end it if he came back," she said. "Did we, for now?" he said. He flexed his bandaged knuckles. "For now's the only honest ending people get. Tomorrow's a different town. So we'll stand it up again tomorrow." She leaned her shoulder into his, a small weight of agreement. They watched as the marshal posted 2 men on the corner, and said words to the night that made the night nod. Widow Perkins fetched them coffee that tasted like Victory's poor cousin but did the job. When they finally walked back along the boardwalk, the wind had found its voice again. It moved through the wire above the corral, and made that low song Emma had learned to hear as warning, and sometimes, if she chose better, as blessing. At her porch, she paused by the letterbox tin lid, spotted with ash, now thumb mark bright on the edge, where hope opened it mornings, and touched it like a charm. "Threats don't get to be the last thing," said she murmured. "No," Samuel agreed. He took her hand then, not for comfort alone, but for inventory. Fingers warm, pulse steady, the simple report a man gives himself when counting what is his to guard. "Sleep," he said. "For a few hours anyway. I'll take the barn." "Inside," she said. "On the settee. The barn's at the edge of town. Trouble always comes from edges first." He thought about it, then nodded. Compromise is another kind of courage. Inside, Widow Perkins had left 2 blankets, and the look a mother gives children she didn't birth, and will scold like her own if they push their luck. Samuel took the settee like a soldier who'd been given a decent bivouac for once in his life. Emma stood by the window and watched the ridge where his cabin would be a dark shoulder by now, and she let her eyes accept the fact that she couldn't see it and still believed in its shape. "Do you hear it?" she asked. "What, the wire?" she said. "It's not screaming." "No," he said from the edge of sleep. "It's humming." "Humming means weather," she said. "Or peace," he said. Maybe both, she said, and allowed the night to hold her. The hours before dawn are the world's old ache. They stretched and snapped and finally let go. Morning arrived blunt and unapologetic. The town woke with the tight shoulders of those who performed acts of heroism and then had to sell eggs. The church bell, with quiet satisfaction, returned to telling the correct time. Emma poured coffee. Samuel rose, rubbed the back of his neck, and took the cup with a nod that included more gratitude than the word thanks could shoulder. They stepped onto the porch together and breathed. The air smelled of wet ash and new day. Somewhere beyond sight, a hawk drew a line nobody else would see and called once. "Threat comes," Samuel said, almost to himself, "and we answer." "We answered," Emma said. Past tense. That matters. He looked at her and found a different kind of fierce than the night knows. It does. They stood there a moment longer, 2 people who had once been strangers to the letter of their own names, and were now quietly beginning to write in the same hand. The road wore last night's scars like a lesson. The fence held. The letterbox waited, the town a stubborn collection of boards bells, and the fragile bravery of ordinary folk took a breath and another, and chose to keep going. Defiance night came early, heavy and copper-colored, like the sky itself had bruised. Whispering pines lay quiet under it. But quiet isn't peace. It's the breath before the storm decides what to break. The town smelled faintly of quenched ash and wet rope from the last fire, the kind of scent that makes people speak softly even when there's nobody to wake. Samuel Reed sat on the porch of Widow Perkins's house, sharpening his knife by lamplight. Each draw of steel on stone rasped through the air, like a clock counting down. The mare was saddled and ready in the shadow of the cottonwood. His revolver lay open on the table beside him, 6 rounds gleaming like small, deliberate promises. Inside, Emma Whitaker packed the barest things, school papers bound with blue ribbon, a book of psalms thumbed soft with grief, and used a single photograph of her parents in Philadelphia winter coats. Widow Perkins fussed behind her, wringing her hands in a dish towel she had no intention of using. "You can't face men like Tilman, child. He's got devils for company tonight." Her voice shook with the echo of last night's bell. Emma fastened the laces on her boots' fingers' steady jaw set. "I've lived under his shadow too long. I won't run from it now. You'll get yourself killed. Then at least it'll be on my feet." Widow Perkins made a small angry noise that was half prayer. She turned to the cupboard and brought out 2 bottles, one of vinegar, one of lamp oil, and set them on the table as if laying down cards in a game she hated to play. You'll need the first for smoke in eyes, if it comes to that. And keep the second where it belongs. Any fool can light ruin. Emma met the old woman's eyes and nodded. We'll bring the town back to you whole as we can. The first riders showed at sundown, dark silhouettes against the ridge. 3, maybe 4, to start. More lights followed, torches flickering like small, hungry mouths. Far behind them, the sky held its bruised copper, refusing the decency of darkness. Samuel stepped inside, closing the door with a quiet finality. They're coming. Emma turned calm as a prayer. How many enough? He pulled the curtain aside, eyes on the horizon smear of flames. They'll head for the school first. It's empty but burning, it makes a point. Then we stop them before they reach it. He gave a short, incredulous laugh. You planning to outgun them? No, she said, and the iron in her voice surprised even her. I plan to outthink them. She crossed to the shelf where Widow Perkins kept odds and ends and reached for a small tin of matches. Into her coat pocket went the match, tin the vinegar, a twist of salt, a square of burlap. If Tilman wants fire, she said, let him taste smoke. Emma Samuel began. This isn't a lesson. She spun the ribbon from her papers tight and tied it again. Hands sure. I've been teaching my whole life. Sometimes the pupils are just taller. The church stood in the center of Whispering Pines, like a stubborn memory, the bell rope rough as honest hand. When Samuel saw Emma take the steps 2 at a time, he understood her plan in the same breath. He hated it. Make them look at you, and you make them come to you, he said, moving to block the steps. Make them look at me, she answered, slipping past anyway. And I make them come to where we're ready. He almost smiled at the defiance in her, the way a man in the desert smiles at a cloud he isn't sure will rain but can't help believing in. All right then. He shoved cartridges into his belt and handed her the short shotgun. If this turns, you get low, under the bell tower against the stone. Understood. By the time the riders thundered into town, the church bell was ringing steady, defiant. Emma had lit it herself, pulling the rope with both hands until the sound carried across the valley like a line thrown to anybody who might still be listening. The tone was clean and hard, not frightened, and it set the dogs to barking and the babies to sleeping deeper. That's what a true bell does to the heart, decides for it. Samuel took position on the saloon's second-story porch rifle, resting on the railing, elbows locked, breath measured. From there he could see the whole of Main Street, the mercantile's blackened awning, the schoolhouse roof, the alley, where a man with poor intentions might try to slither without being seen. He checked the alley twice, then a third time. Nothing moved there but night. Tilman reined in below the belfry, his face gleaming red and torchlight eyes shiny with rage that had never learned manners. His horse danced, his mouth smiled, his hands twitched toward hatred like a habit. Where is she, he bellowed. Where's the schoolmarm? With the loud bell and the loud mouth, Emma stepped out into the street. Her coat was too thin, her face too pale, but her voice carried clear and unafraid. Right here. A hush fell that wasn't silence. It was attention choosing a place to sit. Tilman blinked, thrown by the calm in her tone. You should have left when you had the chance. I did, she said. I left fear behind. His grin twisted. You got a mouth on you, schoolmarm. Maybe I'll shut it myself. Careful, she said. You tried to shut a bell last night. It outsang you. Laughter came from somewhere in the shadows, small, startled, grateful to be told how. Tilman heard it and turned meaner. He motioned to his men. Samuel's rifle cracked once. One torch fell, a man's hat flew, and a glass window 2 buildings down coughed its breath in a glitter of safe empty shards. No one was hit on purpose. The sound alone froze them and told them a different teacher had entered the room. Next one's not a warning, Samuel said, stepping where every man could see him. You want a fight, you got it. But it ends here. Tilman turned on him. You think this is about her? It's about pride. You made me a fool in front of the whole damn town. You didn't need my help for that, Samuel said. For a moment, no one moved. Even the horses held their ribs still. Then Tilman swung his gun up, and the street exploded. Gunfire roared against the storefronts. Glass shattered. Torches dropped and sputtered in the mud and guttered out in offensive little deaths. The bell kept tolling because Emma kept pulling. Her hands burned under the rope, but she didn't stop not until the town had fully woken to itself. Samuel took cover by a water trough, returning shot for shot, methodical as breathing. He aimed low when he could, knees, hands, guns from palms, saving life where life could be saved, and finishing it only when choice demanded it. A bullet split the trough's lip. Cold water spilled into his boots and made his stance truer. Emma ducked behind a wagon whose owner would tomorrow praise the Almighty that his wheels held. She loaded the spare rifle Samuel had taught her to use. The first shot she took was high on purpose to count heads. The second kissed a revolver out of a hand that had never done anything kindly. The third she saved counting breath, waiting for the moment that mattered. Tilman's men faltered under the double lesson of competency and consequence. One fell groaning with a shoulder made new to humility. Another fled into a memory he would name Texas later. But Tilman himself kept firing madness, hollowing his eyes so you could see the thin wires of a man who had built himself out of small cruelties and called it a life. When his revolver clicked empty, he drew a knife and charged through the smoke like a boy who had decided not to grow. Emma rose, heart hammering. Samuel, Tilman reached him, first slammed into his chest, and they hit the ground together, wrestling in the churned mud. Steel flashed. Samuel caught Tilman's knife wrist, the blade trembling an inch above his throat. He could smell the other man's breath, whiskey old meat, and the sharp acid of a person who has slept too long with grievance for company. "You think you're better than me," Tilman spat. Samuel gritted his teeth. "No, just done being worse." He twisted. The knife dropped, a bright decision abandoned, and in the same motion he drove Tilman off with a shove born from a year's worth of fence posts and the weight of choosing not to kill a second before he needed to. Tilman hit the mud with a barked curse. A fallen torch rolled near the spill of kerosene from a lamp kicked over in the first volley. Flame leapt because flame loves invitations. Emma ran forward, grabbed the torch by its unburning end, and kicked dirt to smother the thin tongue of fire crawling toward the kerosene. Heat made her eyes cry, though she didn't feel sad. Tilman staggered to his knees, coughing, staring dumb with the knowledge of fire's speed as it ran toward him. Samuel reached for him, instinct more than mercy. "Move." But Tilman froze, heat painting his face with the color of damnation. Pride and terror wrestled behind his eyes and refused to come to any agreement that involved dignity. "You don't save me, Reed," he snarled, staggering to stand and lunging again, like an answer to a question nobody had asked. "You just prove you're soft." They collided once more, a tangle of anger and decision. Samuel turned them both, used Tilman's momentum to throw him clear of the worst of the kerosene. Still, the body chooses life even when the mouth refuses it, and rolled the other way. The fire hit the oil and roared skyward with the greedy joy of a thing that believes it has found purpose. Samuel barely rolled clear. A sleeve smoldered. He beat it out with the patience of a man dousing old habits. When the smoke thinned enough to count breaths, Tilman lay still. The knife glinted beside his hand, telling the last truth a blade ever tells a man, that it was never loyal. Silence followed, heavy and final. The bell stopped, not because Emma had quit, but because the rope frayed by gunshot gave up and the clapper found its own rest. The space after a bell is always larger than the space before. Emma dropped to her knees beside Samuel. "You're bleeding." He wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "Not mine." The marshal and townsfolk arrived moments later, drawn by the gunfire and the last tolling notes. They took one look at the flames, at the fallen man, at the scattering of weapons that always look foolish once the shouting ends, and understood. "Self-defense," the marshal said quietly. "Not happy, but satisfied in the way a man is when the world has decided to line up with his duty for once. And justice, maybe." Samuel said nothing. He looked past the smoke at the schoolhouse still standing, and then at Emma. Her face was streaked with soot. The ribbon had come half loose from her hair. Her hands shook only after they were no longer needed. He reached without thinking and steadied one of them with his own. "It's over," she said. He shook his head. "Not yet. The fire'll catch if we don't douse it. So they worked together, passing buckets from the well until the flames died to embers. Widow Perkins organized the line like a general. The blacksmith cursed like prayer and lifted like 10 men. A boy of 8 carried water with his jaw set in a man's expression until someone noticed and traded him for a man with a boy's sense. When it was done,